Good.
So good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming. Let me begin by saying that Carleton University acknowledges its location on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. So Kwe and Miigwech to the Omamiwinini Anishinaabe, the people of the watershed of the Kichizibi, aka the Ottawa River. So bonjour, bonsoir tout le monde, et namaskar to those of you of South Asian origin. So it's wonderful to be able to introduce Bill McKibben, someone who probably requires little introduction for most of you due to his deservedly iconic status in environmental circles. Bill drove up all the way from the middle of Vermont today, where he is Schumann Distinguished Professor and Scholar at Middlebury College. Born in Palo Alto, California, he spent 5 years of his childhood in my hometown of Toronto, so I guess that makes him an honorary Canadian. And then he spent the rest of his childhood in Lexington, Massachusetts, where he first honed his journalism skills as a cub reporter. And then he went on to Harvard University, where he edited the Crimson, the Harvard student newspaper. And then after that, he spent 5 years in that flagship of the world of letters, the New Yorker magazine in Manhattan. And then he has published this array of books, probably the most well-known, 1989, The End of Nature, which is now, yes, iconic in the world of environmental letters. Let's call it the environmental humanities. And many more books have followed. And just as an aside, I teach in a Great Books core curriculum program here at Carleton, and I told the students it's not every day that we have an opportunity to host someone who some people already deem to be in that pantheon of authors of the great books. Up there, you know, with Rachel Carson, Aldo Leopold, and maybe even Henry David Thoreau. But you all know that Bill McKibben is much more than just a formidable writer. He is also a formidable organizer and activist, co-founder of 350.org and now inspiring Third Act. He inspires, and in turn, he has been inspired by figures like Thoreau, Martin Luther King Jr., and also, of course, Gandhi. So I want to conclude here just by quoting one short passage that jumped out at me when I was reading his latest book, The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon, and I quote, Bill writes, "I've spent much of my life as an activist trying to make big changes so that we can head off the climate crisis. And in the process, I've come to understand the difference between the inside game and the outside one. The former is important. You need people on the inside of the system who can implement, compromise, push, and pull." Stephen Guilbeault, are you being addressed here? But then Bill continues, but the latter, the outside game, is more important because it's where you change the zeitgeist. All those marches and protests and essays and coalitions, that's actually how over time you change what the world thinks of as normal and natural and obvious. So now I bring you Bill McKibben, changer of the zeitgeist.
What a pleasure to get to be in one of the great cosmopolitan cities of our continent. I must say, when I was asked to do this, I said, sure, I'll come do it in February, because one of my favorite of all urban moments is that throng of people skating along the canal. And so it is with some sadness that I note the ironic aptness of my presence here today, and I hope I'm not the cause of the... and I do note that it's supposed to get cold tonight, so perhaps I've brought you a slight shift in the weather. But that's not the only thing, of course, that one comes to the big city for. And one of those things is the chance to go eat wonderful food of the kind that you can't get out in the country. So as soon as my wife and I got here, before we came today, we went straight around the corner and had a wonderful masala dosa, and it brought back tremendous memories of a wonderful month spent in Kerala 25 or 30 years ago. I've had the great pleasure to travel one end of India to the other, from the leafy streets of Trivandrum up to the very top of Arunachal Pradesh at the Tibetan border. And it's a country I love enormously. Mr. High Commissioner, what a pleasure to get to pay tribute to it. One of the reasons I love it is because of the legacy of Gandhi, who, for my money, was the most important human being of the last century, and quite possibly of the last millennium. A figure of the absolute central importance. There were two great inventions, I think history will decide, of the 20th century. And one of them is going to turn out to be the solar panel, and the other is going to turn out to be the nonviolent social movement. And I think those two things, as I will explain later, probably need each other in order to rise fully to their potential. But it is such a pleasure to be in the company of fellow Gandhians tonight. I try very hard not to be distressed by reading things in the world, because otherwise my life these last 35 years would have been impossible. I will confess to being extremely sad to have read recent accounts of the way that Gandhi in India is increasingly disrespected, and in fact that on occasion his assassin is now commemorated and venerated. And I can say only that in the rest of the world, I think that spirit continues to shine through in the deepest possible way and lighting a potential path for the future in the most crucial sense. I will add that though I think Gandhi is the most important of all figures, my own personal hero of the 20th century, and I think about him often now because of the fight in Gaza, was his great friend and compatriot, Ghaffar Abdul Khan, sometimes called the frontier Gandhi, Badshah Khan, who Gandhi said was the greatest practitioner of nonviolence that he had ever met, and who raised an army of 400,000 Muslim Khudai Khidmat Gar soldiers who fought with the most incredible nonviolent bravery in one of the hardest places in the world for that fight to have been. And I have a picture above my desk of Badshah Khan and Mahatma Gandhi. An excellent picture, among other things, because Khan was about 6'6", I think, and Gandhi wasn't. And the two of them make a good reminder that bigness comes in all sizes. So, what I'm going to do tonight is try to situate us very briefly as to where we are in this story of the climate crisis, the greatest challenge that our species has faced, situate us a little bit scientifically and a little bit politically, and then talk about what, and this is where we'll get to movement building, we're going to need to do if we're going to have some chance of digging ourselves at least a little bit out of the very deep hole into which we've fallen. When I wrote The End of Nature in 1989, I think it was 2023 that basically I must have been thinking of, because last year was the year finally, I think, when the absolute depth of the unraveling of the physical fabric of this planet became so apparent. Right about this time last year, oceanographer friends of mine began calling me up and saying, pay attention to the charts of sea surface temperature around the world because something weird is happening. Obviously, the temperature of the ocean has been rising steadily, but about a year ago, it began to spike in ways and at degrees that we just could not have imagined. And that spiking by early spring was resulting in the highest temperatures we've ever recorded any place in the ocean. In early June, the sea surface buoys off the Florida Keys were recording temperatures of 101 degrees Fahrenheit. I'm an American, so Fahrenheit. Suffice it to say, that's roughly the temperature at which one sets a hot tub, all right? The highest temperatures ever recorded. Obviously, that's been building for a long time, and Canadians have had a front row seat to this, watching the rapid melt of the Arctic. And last year, of course, one of the results of melting the Arctic Ocean became clear when snow cover disappeared very early across the Canadian North, and then with spiking temperatures, we saw the beginnings of those almost unbelievable fires that racked the boreal forest. Those were a tremendous tragedy in every possible way, among other things, putting about twice as much carbon into the atmosphere as all the flying, cooking, heating, driving, cooling that Canadians did last year. That's a feedback loop and a vicious one. The one consolation for me was that it sent an enormous cloud of smoke down south into the power corridor that runs from New York to Washington, where so many of the decisions that have put us in the place where we are now have been made. And it was good for at least a few days for the people living in those powerful places to have some sense of what too many people in this world breathe every single day of their lives. The High Commissioner and I were talking, he's from Delhi, which has experienced the most unbearable air for the last few years. There's about 5 million children in New Delhi, and we think that 2.5 million of them have irreversible lung damage just from breathing the air. So that's why I was in Washington as it happened, sitting in outside the White House in May on the day when Washington recorded the worst air quality it ever recorded, thanks to the fires of Canada. The White House was 100 yards away, but you couldn't see it. It's important once in a while that the powerful feel what the powerless deal with at all times. That heat came on land and came with a vengeance. The summer solstice in the northern hemisphere is always the period of the hottest days on our planet, just because there's more land mass in the northern hemisphere, and so that holds the heat. We have a global daily average temperature for the planet. We have thermometers all over the planet, we have buoys in the ocean, and we have satellites. And so from them we can construct each day a temperature of the Earth, an average temperature of the Earth. Right around the solstice last year, we began to have a series of days where that number went not just off the charts, but off the wall that charts were tacked to. We were seeing values a degree Celsius higher than we'd seen in the past. The scientists told us that these were the hottest days we'd ever measured on planet Earth. Now, those direct measurements with thermometers only go back about 200 years, but scientists are very good at extending that record with a series of proxies, ice cores, ocean sediments, so on and so forth. By the end of June, beginning of July, the climatologists were saying with great confidence that we were experiencing the hottest days on planet Earth in at least 125,000 years. 125,000 years ago, the archaeologists tell us, was right about the moment that humans started sort of etching symbols on pieces of bone and things. It's right about the very deepest corner of what we might begin to call human culture. No society that we would recognize as a society has ever lived through a climatic regime like the one we are now living through. And we're beginning to sense just how chaotic that's going to be. If you want one physical fact to understand our century, it's that warm air holds more water vapor than cold. That means that you get more evaporation, more drought, and more fire in arid areas. But it also means, since the residence time in the atmosphere for a molecule of water vapor is only about 7 days, that what goes up is going to come down, and increasingly it comes down in buckets, in deluge, in the wet parts of the world, like this one. Vermont, where I live, had the worst flooding in its history last summer, because it had the biggest rainstorms we've ever seen. Our capital city, Montpelier, is still basically shut for business because all the stores and restaurants and things were completely flooded. My small town where I live on the spine of the Green Mountains got more water than any other place in Vermont. We lost a house about a quarter mile from mine in a landslide, and then the roads, both east and west out of town, were closed for the better part of a month, cutting us off from the rest of the world. But Vermont, like Canada, is still affluent enough that we can absorb some of those punches, at least for the moment. And that is not true of many other places. In September, it was Libya that had the single biggest rainstorm that they've ever had in their history. But in that case, the rainfall was enough to wash out 2 huge dams, and then the river that washed those dams out tore through a city, washing 10,000 people out to sea where they drowned in an hour. That's the kind of thing that now happens around the world all the time, and it happens most in the places that have done the least to cause this problem. The iron law of global warming is the less you did to cause it, the sooner and harder you are hit by it. All of Africa has produced about 3% of all the greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. That's it. The United States alone has produced 25% of all the greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere. And Canadians, I'm sorry to say, on a per capita basis, are even slightly better than Americans at producing greenhouse gas emissions, you know. This is a problem caused here more than any place else on the planet. No one else will ever catch up with North America, not China, not anybody else. And all that stuff is still up there. The carbon dioxide that poured out of the tailpipe of my family's maroon Plymouth Fury when I was getting my driver's license at age 15 in suburban Boston is still up there in the atmosphere trapping heat. Okay. By the end of the year, the temperature on this planet was about 1.5 degrees Celsius higher than it had been before the Industrial Revolution. So if you'll remember, that was the target that we set aside in Paris in 2015 as the thing we were going to try and avoid. We have not avoided it. We are still on a path to raise the temperature of the planet nearly 3 degrees Celsius if we keep on as we're going at the moment. If anything like that happens, there will not be civilizations like the ones we have known. Among other things, the prediction is that that would be enough to produce somewhere between 1 and 3 billion refugees on planet Earth. 1 million refugees at the southern border of the US have been enough to discombobulate our politics in my country and produce the worst kind of that's why Donald Trump somehow became president of the United States, you know. So imagine 1,000 times more people than that on the move and try to figure out what the world looks like. We have to do everything we possibly can, not to stop global warming, it is too late for that, but to stop its rise short of the point where it cuts civilization off at the knees. That is the greatest challenge that human beings have ever faced, and we do not have much time to do it. If you took away one thing from this talk tonight, that would be it. This is a timed test. Humans are not used to timed tests. Most of our political questions occur over and over and over again, and we make some progress and we backslide a little and we continue on, and the next generation takes them over, and so on and so forth. This one is not like that. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change told us 3 years ago that if we wanted to have any hope of keeping to those targets we set in Paris, that we needed to cut emissions on this planet in half by 2030. 2030 by my watch is 5 years and 11 months away. That leaves not much time to do the most important task that humans have ever tried to undertake. All right, the really hard part is over now. And I'm going to take a breath, and maybe I'll even have a little bit of water, and you can take a breath too. I'm going to tell you a little bit better news, which is that we know in a way we did not know even a few years ago what we need to do to deal with this. Conceptually, climate change is not that difficult a problem. It's caused by burning coal and gas and oil. Therefore, you have to stop burning coal and gas and oil, and that means you have to find something else to burn to power a modern economy, a modern growing economy, since the developing world wants and has every right to develop in the same path that others have. Happily, the world's scientists and engineers have done us a tremendous favor. Over the last 10 years, they've managed to drop the price of renewable energy, energy from the sun and the wind, by roughly 90%. Sometime in the last 3 or 4 years, we passed a point where an invisible line where that price dropped below the price of burning fossil fuel. We live on a planet where the cheapest way to produce power is to point a sheet of glass at the sun. That is a remarkable moment in human history. It allows us to imagine the rapid end to combustion on the surface of the planet. Combustion has served us well. Human beings have been setting things on fire for 700,000 years or so. That's what the archaeologists tell us. When we learned to cook food, it gave us a large brain. It allowed us fire to move north and south away from the equator. Pre-fire, no one was going to live in Ottawa. The scientists, the anthropologists even tell us that gathering around the campfire every night for eons accounts for some of the social bonds that mark our species, a kind of proto-Zoom, you know. And when we learned to control the combustion of first coal and then oil and gas in the Industrial Revolution, that produced modernity. That produced the world that we know. However, we're now at the moment when the costs dramatically outweigh the benefits of that combustion. Not only this existential climate crisis, but also the fact that 9 million human beings a year die from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel. That's 1 death in 5 on this planet. If you've been to Delhi or to Shanghai or someplace in recent years, that won't completely surprise you. But North America, too, has hundreds of thousands of cases of childhood asthma every year. And we know who gets to live next to highways and by refineries and things. This divide is not just global north and south, it's within every country on earth as well. And of course, the final problem with relying on fossil fuel, with relying on anything that's only available in a few places, is that the people who control those few places get way more power than they should have. So in the American context, our biggest oil and gas barons are the Koch brothers, and they took their money and used it to degrade our democracy. In the Middle East, it's the king of Saudi Arabia. in Europe, it's Vladimir Putin, who took his winnings from the oil and gas lottery and used them to fund a land war in Europe in the 21st century. In Canada, it may be, I'm just an across-the-border observer of Canadian politics, but it feels like perhaps the government of Alberta may have more power than it needs or can safely exercise. And the point is, none of these things are any longer necessary. We could stop combustion on this planet because the good Lord was kind enough to hang a large ball of burning gas 93 million miles up in the sky, and we now have the wit to take full advantage of it. We can catch its rays on photovoltaic panels. We can take advantage of the fact that it differentially heats the earth, producing the winds that turn those turbines. And now we have batteries, ever more inexpensive, to allow us to store that power when the sun goes down or the wind drops. The economics of this is astonishing. In India now, it's cheaper to build a new solar farm than it is merely to buy the coal for an existing coal-fired power plant. Okay? So over time, economics will take care of this problem. Eventually, free will win out. Okay? Our problem is, you'll recall, that we don't have time. Eventually is not a useful figure here. Once the Arctic is melted, nobody has a plan for how you freeze it back up again. Okay? We go past a series of one-way ratchets from which there is no return. That's why 2030 is the interesting figure for scientists, not 2050 or 2100. This problem is gathering such galloping momentum that if we don't arrest it soon, we won't. So it's going to take more than mere economics to make a difference. We're going to have to set policy in ways that forces this transition to happen as fast as possible. That would be hard to do even if everybody was working in good faith. We're essentially pulling the guts out of the world's economic engine and replacing it on the fly while the whole thing is running. Not easy, okay? At the edge of the capacity of humans to accomplish. But the trouble is, not everybody is acting in good faith. We have had for the last 35 years the constant and ongoing obstruction of the fossil fuel industry. We now know from great investigative reporting that they knew everything there was to know about climate change back in the 1980s when I was writing that book. Exxon, for instance, had set all its scientists, or some of its scientists, to understand what was happening. And they had good scientists. They were the biggest company on the earth then. And they produced good science. When we found it now in archives and things, it turns out that their scientists predicted with unerring accuracy what the temperature would be in 2020. And they were believed by their executives. Companies like Exxon began building all their drilling rigs higher to compensate for the rise in sea level they knew was coming. Okay? What they did not do was tell the rest of us. Instead, they invested billions in this architecture of deceit and denial and disinformation that kept us locked for all these years in this completely sterile debate about whether or not global warming was real. A debate that both sides knew the answer to at the beginning. It's just one of them was willing to lie, and that lie may turn out to be the most consequential in human history because it cost us that thing we needed, which was time. So, in order to overcome that extraordinary power, which continues to this day, we're past the point where sheer climate denial works. Too many things have caught on fire at this point for that to really wash. But now the new denial is delay, the idea that we should take a long time, that we have to go slowly, that on and on and on. To overcome that requires, I finally, and it took me too long to figure this out, more than just books and things. It requires movements. Because we've won the argument about climate change long since. The science hasn't been in doubt for 3 decades. We've won the argument. We're just losing the fight because the fight isn't about data and reason and evidence. The fight's about what fights are always about, which is money and power. And the fossil fuel industry has so much of both that they can keep their business model going. That's why I started 350.org almost 20 years ago with myself and 7 college students. None of us had any idea what we were doing. I'm not I'm a writer by nature, you know. The exact opposite thing of you can tell I'm not a great public speaker, and it's fun to be here with you tonight, but really I'd rather be home in my room typing, you know. That's what I like to do. But we knew we had to try and build some power. And we turned quite explicitly to the lessons of the 20th century, to Gandhi, to Dr. King, and to the millions of others whose names we don't know as well, who tried to figure out how somehow the small and the many could stand up to the mighty and the few. That's really what we talk about when we talk about nonviolent social movements. So when we started 350.org, the very first thing we did was, there were 7 students at this little college in Vermont. There are 7 continents. Each one took one. The guy who took the Antarctic also had to take the internet, you know, and we set out to do our work and try and find people like ourselves on every part of the world. And we did. Within a year or so, we announced this plan for a global day of action all around the planet. And we told everybody, do something to mark this. 350, by the way, takes its strange name from what the scientists tell us is the most carbon we could safely have in the atmosphere. 350 parts per million, a number we're way north of, which is why Canada catches on fire. But we took that sort of strange name because we figured that it would be easier to organize across language boundaries using Arabic numerals, not English words. And so it turned out to be. That first day of action, coming on 20 years ago now, managed to get 5,100 demonstrations simultaneously in 181 countries. CNN called it the most widespread day of political action in the planet's history. And it was beautiful to watch. The very first of them was in Addis Ababa with 10,000 kids out in the street chanting 350. But they were coming from all over, from places across the planet, and people bringing wit to bear on this issue, and people being very brave. Even then, China was not an easy place to do this kind of thing, but there were 200 demonstrations there. We could not do this today, I must say, in China, and in a lot of other places where authoritarianism has begun to make civil protest much harder. Those are your brothers and sisters in the Maldives. That's the Student Government Association of the Maldives, holding their meeting in the lagoon to demonstrate the existential problem that comes from living. People have lived in the Maldives for 5,000 years, okay? But they probably aren't going to make it through this century because the highest point in that archipelago is a couple of meters above sea level, you know? There were, from that first day, several hundred pictures that just ended up in a file called 350 Adorable, and they really were adorable, but they were also hard to look at. Those girls are likely to be refugees in their lifetime and not from anything that they did, okay? So I look into the eyes of that girl in the middle sometimes and just sort of think about that sometimes. We've organized, we think, about 20,000 demonstrations on every country in the planet now except North Korea. And some of them have been very beautiful. We did this thing that people called the biggest art project in the history of the world when we staged these giant things around the world that had so many people that we needed satellites to kind of take the image. This is one of those dry riverbeds in the Southwest. When the satellite came over, 2,000 or 3,000 people put up blue blankets for a second to bring the river back to life, you know. And we would have loved to go on doing that kind of educational work, but time was pressing too hard, so we also switched to real confrontation, although in a very nonviolent way. Here are some shots from the beginning of the fight against the Keystone Pipeline from Canada across the US, which became the signal environmental battle of the last decade. It was this protest, which I helped organize, was the biggest civil disobedience action in America about anything in a very long time. 1,254 people went to jail, and it was powerful and beautiful, and as you know, eventually it prevailed, and gave rise to 1,000 other protests against 1,000 other pipelines and terminals and on and on and on, all of which are still being fought, and many of them in this country, and many thanks to the people fighting things like the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the Coastal Gas Link and so on and so forth. These are a quick picture from 400,000 people gathering in New York City about exactly a decade ago now, the biggest climate march that till then had happened. But this, at the very same time, I want to show you these pictures from the Pacific because they illustrate what I was saying before. In those Pacific islands, Tuvalu, Vanuatu, the Marshalls, the Solomons, places that may not exist by the end of the century because they're too low to the water. In each of them, their slogan of the 350 in the Pacific was, "We're not drowning, we're fighting," okay? And they built a wooden canoe, a wooden war canoe in the tradition of each of their islands, and they took them to Newcastle in Australia, which is the biggest coal port in the world, and they used them for a day to blockade the biggest ore ships on the planet. It was a beautiful and effective thing, but it also produces one of those tropes, one of those images that just illustrates a key trope in the human imagination, that fight of the small and the many. This is you know, the Death Star and the rebels, you know. This is the British Empire running up against some people making salt on the beach. This is a powerful, powerful moment. So I'm going to bring you just up to date for me to the present for 1 second here. Because one of the best things about that work was that it started to help energize young people into this process. I started with college students. One of the things we did at 350 was this vast fossil fuel divestment campaign, still ongoing, which has become the biggest anti-corporate campaign in history. We're at $40 trillion in endowments and portfolios that have divested from coal or gas or oil. But the biggest harvest of that campaign was the young people who did it on college campuses around the world. And we've divested, you know, Harvard and Oxford and Cambridge and Princeton and the University of California, you know, just on and on and on, and including now a number of Canadian campuses. And the kids who did that work, when they graduated, wanted to keep on doing it. In the US, they formed this thing called the Sunrise Movement that brought us the Green New Deal. And the Green New Deal, once it had gone through the congressional sausage-making machinery, was reduced in size to the Inflation Reduction Act, which nonetheless is still the biggest shot of money that the renewable energy economy has ever gotten, many thanks to Joe Biden. And so those kids are fantastic. And of course, the same around the world. You all watched the rise of Greta Thunberg, who's one of my favorite people in the world to work with. I adore her. I had the great pleasure of getting to write her a letter last June on the occasion of her graduation from high school. Think about that for a moment, okay? But you know what? I heard, and I look around the demographic composition of this audience with some intent at this point. I heard at one point a few too many people my age say, "Oh, it's up to the next generation to deal with these problems," which seemed A, ignoble, but B, also highly impractical. Young people, for all their energy and intelligence and idealism, lack the structural power to make change on the scale that we need in the time that we still have. We do not have the time for people to grow up and become CEOs and premiers and on and on and on. We have to make this change now, and so they need our backing if you look around for who has structural power, well, one way I've started to say it is, if you've begun to have hair growing out your ears, you probably have structural power coming out your ears too, you know. In the US, there are 70 million of us over 60, which is the population of France. 10,000 more every day, which is more people that are born in the US every day, okay, who pass their 60th birthday. Not only are there a lot of us, we punch above our weight politically because we all vote. There is no known way to prevent old people from voting, okay? Not only that, we ended up with most of the money. In the US, the boomers and the silent generation have about 70% of the country's financial assets. So if you want to push around Washington or Wall Street, which are the things that need to be pushed around in my country, then you need some people with hairlines like mine. That's why we started this thing called Third Act about 2 years ago, and it has grown like topsy. We've got chapters now in every state and many tens of thousands of volunteers doing incredible work. Much of it just the mundane work of lobbying, writing letters, calling officials, sitting at public meetings, all of that, but also some of the more direct work that we, when we think about the kind of movie Gandhi, those are the parts we focus on, so we've done some of that too. One of the targets we tried to take on are the huge banks that fund the fossil fuel industry. And so let me just skip ahead here. These are a couple of pictures from a day we did last March when we had demonstrations in 100 cities against Citi and Chase and Wells Fargo and Bank of America, the 4 biggest funders of the fossil fuel industry on planet Earth. You know who's 5th? RBC, yes, RBC. So at any rate, it was a beautiful day of action with a lot of old people demonstrating that they were still completely capable of all sorts of good action. I was in DC that day where we had a huge sit-in and closed down those banks for the day. How did we do it? We're somewhat too old to sprawl on the sidewalk for hours at a time. And so we went to every Goodwill store in the greater Washington area and got every rocking chair that they had. And that's what we used. The next day, the New York Times was calling it the Rocking Chair Rebellion. Okay? It's worth remembering, by the way, that Gandhi was no spring chicken when he was engaged at the very height of his work. He got a pretty late start in everything, and so a perfect example of the fact that people of a certain age are completely competent to do what needs doing. It was beautiful. That's my 93-year-old mother out protesting at the. This past fall, we've helped wage with some allies on the Gulf Coast of the United States this huge fight against LNG export out of the US, liquefied natural gas. This sounds like a kind of arcane subject, but when I started writing about it last summer for The New Yorker, I began to understand that it was the biggest fossil fuel expansion project on planet Earth. The US is already the biggest LNG exporter in the world, but if this industry had gotten everything that they wanted, and until very recently they got every permit they've ever asked for, within 10 years, US LNG exports would have produced more greenhouse gas emissions than everything that happens on the continent of Europe. Every car, home, factory from Athens to Helsinki would have been producing less methane and CO2 than US LNG. So we had to figure out how to stop this, and we mounted this big campaign with the people on the ground whose lives were being wrecked by these terminals, and with people across the country who understood that climate change, and Third Act was at the heart of it. I was supposed to be going from here directly to Washington for a big series of sit-ins at the Department of Energy next week, and it was all going to be people my age. And we had those rocking chairs all lined up ready to go again until a week ago today, when Joe Biden, bless his heart, said, we're pausing all new permits for these LNG export facilities. He took the language that all the countries of the world signed onto in Dubai in December. You may recall that at the end of that farcical global climate conference run by an oil executive from Abu Dhabi, nonetheless, countries were under enough pressure that they put one sentence in that document that said the time has come to transition away from fossil fuel. That was the first time in 28 of these global climate meetings that the words fossil fuel had ever been mentioned. It's as if you'd had 28 conferences on lung cancer before someone thought to say cigarettes might have something to do with this, you know? But that sentence was in there thanks to great pressure from people around the world. And Joe Biden made that sentence real last week with that move. It's going to take a lot to make it stick. Big oil is howling. They're doing everything they can to turn it around. But we need it to stick in the US, and we need it to spread around the world. We need countries like Canada to say, we are serious about not just building more green energy, but about transitioning off the dirty energy now. We can't keep building stuff that's supposed to last 40 or 50 or 75 years. That makes no sense. So that's what I got. I will just close by saying a couple of things. One, there's a series of trainings going on here about nonviolent direct action in the next few weeks in Ottawa. And I think people are handing out placards about them. But if you don't know how to do this, kind of stuff, come and do some of that training, and as you do, you will join in the lineage that stretches back to Gandhi and beyond. Gandhi spent most of his life just teaching people how to do these sort of things, you know, teaching with his life. And the second thing I'll tell you is, I do not know, and I cannot guarantee to you, that we are going to win this fight, even if we do everything right at this point. You know, Dr. King, my other great hero of the century, used to end talks by saying, quoting from the Massachusetts abolitionist Theodore Parker, he would say, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. I.e., this may take a while, but we're going to win. Okay? Which was a very comforting thing for the very brave people in that civil rights movement to be able to think as they were being bombed and imprisoned and shot and whatever else. That is one comfort we do not have, because the arc of the physical universe is short and it bends toward heat. And if we don't win this fast, we will not win it. But if I can't guarantee you that we will win, I can guarantee you that if you engage wholeheartedly in this fight, then you will have brothers and sisters everywhere around the world with you doing it. Don't try to do it by yourself. The North American bent towards individualism means that we immediately start thinking about what's on our roof and what's in our garage and things. That's good. I'm glad I have solar panels on my roof and they connect to an EV and whatever. But we're not going to win this one Tesla at a time. The most important thing an individual can do is be a little less of an individual and join together with others in movements large enough to make actual change. Do it. Thank you.
Questions. We're a big house, so I would ask you to keep your questions focused and make them questions. We don't have, maybe people could maybe start standing in those stairwells, and I'll pass the mic, and Larry will on the other side.
Hi, I'm Ken Johnson. I'm working now with a group of several people here tonight called Seniors for Climate Action Now, There's many groups across Ontario, and we were just meeting today. We had a Zoom call today with about 15 people trying to figure out how to increase the number of people involved. Bill, my question is, do you think I could get everyone in this room that's over 60 to join our group? And would it be okay to get the list of emails of people who attended tonight to facilitate that better than having them write their name down on a piece of paper? Bill, you don't have an extra clipboard with you tonight, do you?
And I will just say, here's one of the things we've been saying that's proved true, I think, in our work. One of the reasons that people did not try to organize older people for a very long time.
Bill, we're not older people. I played hockey this afternoon, man.
I'm going cross-country skiing tomorrow morning if I possibly can, but not quite as fast as once I did. One of the reasons that people did not try this for a long time was because political scientists were firmly of the belief that people become more conservative as they age. And there's maybe been some truth to that over time. People get more stuff, and so that, but if it was true once, I think no longer, because think about it for a minute. If you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s now, your first act was in that period of extraordinary social and cultural and political transformation that marked the 1960s and 1970s. When we started taking women seriously in public life, when the civil rights movement was at its apex, when the first Earth Day in my country drew 20 million people into the streets. I tell Americans, if you have any doubt about that, look at what our crazy Supreme Court attacked in their rampage over the last couple of years. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Gun Control Act of 1968, the Clean Air Act of 1971, and Roe v. Wade 1973. So having stood up for progressive ideals once upon a time, we are capable of doing it again. In fact, it is in our DNA to do that generationally. And so but it's a very good idea to try and figure out some ways to remind people of that. One of those ways is with the kind of culture of that period when young people come up to me and say, with some justification, say, "Okay, boomer." I just smile, but then I do say sometimes, if I'm in a cheeky mood, I say, "Yes, but you'll have to agree that our generation did produce the greatest music of all time," and so we've had great good luck. We've had Carole King and Bette Midler and Patti Smith, and we've had, and you can borrow him back, your great Canadian Neil Young helping us out. So it's important to try and raise that spirit, I think. So good luck to you, and we'll help in all the ways we can.
Thank you.
Hi, Bill. My name is Janet Marenica, and I'm a climate reality leader. And I'm also involved with She Changes Climate, a global organization that was very present at COP. The question that I have is, here in Ontario, our energy source that is the largest is nuclear power. It represents about 60% of our total energy source. And in the world of today, it's looked at as clean energy. There are people who we know who have been working on nuclear power and the safety issue since 3 Mile Island and before.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering, from your perspective, how we can go beyond the language of clean energy and lowest GHGs to really look at the impact that it's having in our communities,
Mm-hmm.
which is a waste that will never leave us and has not left us
It's
and is everywhere.
It's a good question, and you may not completely like my answer. We're in an existential emergency now. And so in an emergency, you do things that you wouldn't otherwise do. You know, you tie a tourniquet on an arm or whatever it is. Now, I think we should be very careful about closing down existing nuclear power plants that we've built and paid for and that are producing clean energy. Because I think that the risk is lower than the risk of what's happening with the absolutely rapid rise in temperature. That said, I do not think that nuclear power represents a big part of the answer to the problem that we're in. And I think that not only because of the safety issues that you raise, but also fundamentally because it's pretty expensive. I mean, Canada's figured out how to do it more cheaply than some places, and if you're going to do it, it's a good idea to make all your nuclear reactors the same design and figure out that sort of thing. But even so, the price of renewable energy has been dropping like a rock, and the price of nuclear energy, because it's a big, complicated construction project, keeps rising, okay? And we don't have an endless supply of money on this planet to waste on this. So when I meet people who are true nuclear zealots, and there are plenty out there,
And they're growing.
I thank them for their service, you know, and because it's, you know, the original dream of nuclear power was a clean and cheap energy, and on both counts, it's come up somewhat short. But I remind them that as we move towards energy from solar power and wind, that is, as we move to energy that comes from the sun, what we are doing is utilizing the biggest nuclear reactor in the neighborhood, just one that operates at a safe distance from where we are. So that you may be able to help persuade someone with going forward. Thank you.
I have a question. I'm a journalism and humanities student here at Carleton, and I just have a question for you. Do you know of any specific new innovations that have been made recently that you think can help combat the climate crisis?
New, like, technological innovations?
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, there's new technological innovations coming all the time, and they're increasingly aimed at the sectors that are going to what we call hard to abate, the places that are hardest to change. So things like making steel, or flying airplanes, or things where it's hardest to just put electricity directly to work. But people are figuring out more and more how to do some of those things. The good news is that we already have the technology that we need for most of what we need to do. The great bulk of the work is simply to take what is cheap solar and wind power and apply it as widely as we can. And that's starting to happen. In June last year, I told you we had the hottest temperatures we've had in 125,000 years. The same month, for the first time, human beings started installing more than a gigawatt of solar power a day. So the rough equivalent of a nuclear power plant's worth of solar panels every day. Granted, half of that was in China, but it still leaves a lot in the rest of the world. And that moment, it's not the pace that we need to be at to match the physics of climate change, but it's approaching the right direction. And it shows that we could ramp this up, especially if we could move the fossil fuel industry out of the way. That's the biggest innovation that we need, is a way to break the political power of the fossil fuel industry. And that can only be done as we build movements to try and match their money. But it's a very good question, and engineers are going to have plenty to work on for a long time. And if you are a great engineer, if you know how to make a solar panel 3% more efficient, leave right now and get back to the lab, okay? But for the rest of us who don't, then our job is to build the series of political conditions that allow that work to flower most fully. Thank you.
Thank you.
I just wonder what you think
So
about these different communications messages and tactics.
Sure. Here's how I think about how to set campaigns and tactics. And in many ways it's drawn from the playbook that Gandhi and Dr. King and other people in the 20th century devised. Remember, all of these figures came in essence from the margins, and we owe them an extraordinary debt for starting to figure out. And it's always good to remember how little we know about nonviolence and what a new, look, every country in the world has an academy where they go study violence, like West Point or whatever, okay? And so we're good at it. We know how to fight wars and what flanking maneuvers look like and how, on and on and on. But nobody set up a West Point yet for, how to make, we have Gandhi's ashram in India where people do come and teach courses occasionally and things, but not on the scale we yet need. So take this for what it's worth. I think a good campaign requires two things to really work. It requires a plausible path to a victory, and it requires that victory be large enough to make a serious difference. And if you have those two things, then you're usually able to rally people around it, I think. So, for instance, this LNG export thing we've been doing. We figured out that there were ways to explain why it was so important. That thing I told you about how more greenhouse gas emissions than all of Europe, that caught on with people. And we had a plausible mechanism. The President of the United States had to sign a document for each one of these things saying that it was in the public interest before it could be allowed to export gas to most of the countries of the world. So we had, and we thought that we had ways to persuade and pressure the President to do that, especially in an election year. So those two things allowed us to build a big campaign that yielded a big result, okay? That's how we tend to think about campaigns. There's lots of other ways to think about them, and sometimes there are things that are just sort of dramatic and shocking and get people's attention. At this point, I would think we've wrung most of the value out of throwing soup on paintings, okay? So I would not recommend that as the next thing. If it may have been a very good idea the first 3 or 4 old masters, but we're, at a certain point you reach sort of soup saturation, There's lots of tactics, lots of things to try, but that's how I tend to think about building campaigns, and it often works best, as it did in this case, when you have some combination of people intensely affected on the ground. So, my friends in Burnaby and Vancouver, the First Nations there, who's, they're going to ram a pipeline through the middle of their land into, to get tar sands oil out to the Pacific. So the combination of them and a kind of generalized set of people across Canada who care about climate change. And those two things, often that intensity and that scope, often allow for things to blow up in a big way. So that just tactically, that's how I tend to think about things. And I do think that just continuing to study how Gandhi pulled off campaigns like this is incredibly interesting. That's what the American civil rights movement leaders that I've really learned the most from, that's who they learned the most from. All those, Dr. King, who arose out of nowhere at the age of, in his 20s as a minister in Montgomery, Alabama, was very dependent on 4 or 5 young American civil rights workers who had made pilgrimages to India. And Gandhi had been assassinated by that point, but there were still really serious Gandhian companions of his around from whom they learned an enormous amount and brought it back to the US. And that's kind of the lineage now that kind of, I think, more than anything else, informs how we think about this kind of movement building. So some study is great. And I was talking about Badshah Khan before. I think that no, you said they showed that movie about him here recently, and there's a book called A Man to Match His Mountains by Eknath Easwaran that's for me been an incredibly important guide to thinking about because his legacy is understudied and appreciated, but extraordinary, truly extraordinary. Yes, someone else is, I'm not picking them, so someone there's a microphone over here, and then we'll come to you, and then we'll stop, because I'm holding you all here against your will at this point.
Okay, good evening, everyone. My name is Tamim from Environmental Studies at Carleton. I've been involved in environmental activism since 2016 from Afghanistan and also in Ottawa, Canada. Afghanistan is one of the countries which has no, basically, contribution in global CO2. But it's highly impacted by climate change. And we have been doing a lot of active work in Afghanistan and here. But a question that I always had was that since we're running out of time, should we go ahead with like big nonviolent movements or like with small, harsher movements like blocking places as you did, which I couldn't find a clear answer so far. And I wanted to hear your idea. Thanks.
Good question, and again, it's sort of on tactics and things. Often one of the ways that you can build big, broad movements is to have a few dramatic things that capture people's attention and allow things to expand. Gandhi's Salt Satyagraha was a perfect example of that, and the way that it blew up quickly and soon transformed the subcontinent. So if you can, and we have other examples. One of the ways to think about this, you cannot stop the fossil fuel industry by blowing up pipelines, I don't think. I think violence of any kind won't work here. I think it's a bad idea for my own reasons. I mean, I'm a Methodist Sunday school teacher. What does that tell you? But I also think it's completely impractical. This system is too big and strong, and the thing that it thrives on is violence. You do not want to pick the weapons that your adversary has in spades, you know. And that was one of Gandhi's great intuitions. But you can figure out a series of gestures that really matter. Gandhi was one of the greatest, and Badshah Khan in Afghanistan, Pakistan, were the greatest practitioners of that politics of gesture, you know. That's what making salt was. Dr. King and Rosa Parks sitting down in the bus was a gesture that illustrated. In our time, the greatest example of that was Greta Thunberg, saying, I'm not going to go to school. Why should I go to school if you're unwilling to build a world that I'm going to have a future in anyway? Why are you asking me to prepare myself? That gesture spoke so eloquently that it raised, 10 million kids around the world. So if you can find those, that's what, for instance, we were trying to do with the rocking chairs that I was talking about. If you can figure out sort of gestures like that, they deeply magnify power because the thing about nonviolence is it shouldn't work. It's a getting arrested, getting beat up by the police is a demonstration of your powerlessness, right? It should have exactly the opposite effect. But sometimes there's some kind of alchemical property that often comes, especially with kind of unearned suffering of some sort or another, that allows that transmutation. So look for those ways to intercede when you can. We promised one more down here.
Yeah, my question has to do with the American election that's coming up. I'm interested to know how Third Act intends, or what plans you might have. You don't have to reveal all your secrets here, but what plans you might have to engage those running for office in the fight for the climate crisis. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got no secrets. I'm a completely open book, and truthfully, that's one of the things that I've also taken from Gandhi. In the stories of his campaigns, he always wrote to his adversaries, the British, before he did anything and said, this is what I'm going to do. And he thought it was only fair and sporting, but also, I think, understood that it was powerful in its own right. I think surprise is highly overrated as a tactic. So I'll be completely forthright. We're going to endorse Joe Biden next week. Not because we love everything that he's ever done. We don't. But because A, it's kind of an easy call. He's running against a guy who is an adjudicated rapist, whose main contribution to climate policy was to pull America out of the Paris Climate Accords. Okay, so it's not like, you know, whatever. Yes, that's very true, and we've spoken out dramatically against that at Third Act. And one of the things that were said, and I was writing this endorsement in the last few days. You know, Biden's age is going to be the biggest issue in this election, and in some ways, rightly so. I mean, we actually think that it's a good idea to kind of, as John Kennedy once said, pass the torch to a new generation. I think we'd be better off if he had done so. But that's not the choice that we have. And so in this case, his age is actually, I think, one of his assets for this reason. He was socialized in a different America than the one we live in now. The first election that he got to vote in was Lyndon Baines Johnson versus Barry Goldwater in 1964. Okay, so he is an old guy. There's no getting around it. But that means that his understanding of what a government should do was directly in that FDR New Deal, we can help, America is a group project kind of idea. And that runs very through what his presidency has been so far, a huge attempt to put the government behind lots of important things. Even people that I admire who came before him, like Barack Obama, who is considerably younger, Obama's first election was Reagan versus Carter. So he was overawed, I think, and he said so in some of the exit interviews from his presidency, by the incredible weight of that Reagan presidency, and by the idea that markets should solve all problems, and that the best thing the government could do was get out of the way, that government was the problem, not the solution, on and on and on. A set of ruinous ideas that have left us with melted poles and grotesque and cartoonish inequality. So for that reason, I'm very glad that Biden comes from that earlier place. But, as I wrote in this thing, the thing that brought down LBJ was the misadventure in Vietnam. And it would be very wise for Biden to pay attention to that. Do I think that Donald Trump would have handled the situation better? I do not. I think he would have handled it far, far worse. And just as Richard Nixon did a far worse job than Hubert Humphrey would have done dealing with the war in Vietnam. But I do think it's a very good caution, since we were talking about Biden and electoral politics, and I do think it's a very important moment for people to be thinking about how we take not just this most existential problem that we face, climate, but a series of other problems that we all know that we have to solve. One of those is what's happened in Palestine and Israel. We have let it continue as a untended sore for decades, just hoping that it wouldn't blow up at any particular point. But now that it has blown up, it is time to deal with it straightforwardly and powerfully. And that's the reason that I talked so much about Badshah Khan tonight. I want people to remember that one of, if not the greatest practitioner of nonviolence ever, was a Muslim who raised an incredible nonviolent army of 400,000 other Muslims. And that should be a reminder to us that there is no sectarian, typology here to set in. We need more than we have ever needed it, the power that Gandhi began to unleash on this earth 100 years ago. It was an extraordinary gift that we were given by Gandhi. Just as it's an extraordinary gift that we've been given by the engineers who brought us the power of the sun close to home. If we can unite those two things somehow, then we have a chance yet to transform this tired and despairing old world into something new again, and that is worth spending one's life on. Thank you very much. Take care. Thank you, sir. Oh, real pleasure.
So thank you all so much, especially obviously to Bill. I'm sorry that some of you had questions that will have to be handled over some tea in the atrium. I just have to thank a few people as well. First and foremost, the Mahatma Gandhi Peace Council of Ottawa that's largely made this possible. Also, we had support from the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies. We have support from the Davidson Fund in the Program for the Study of Religion here at Carleton, which is part of the College of the Humanities, and the College of the Humanities Great Books program itself. So thank you very much, and let's have a little sustenance, pretty meager sustenance, but some beverages around the corner.